What happens when a Hollywood star known for his calm, thoughtful presence suddenly finds himself in the middle of a live television showdown? What happens when a conversation meant to promote a new film spirals into something far more personal, far more uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore? It begins quietly, almost too quietly, but by the end of it, the room feels electric, the audience is frozen in shock, and millions of viewers at home are leaning closer to their screens wondering the same thing. Did that really just happen? Before we dive into this unforgettable moment, make sure you subscribe to Stage View, hit that like button, and tell us in the comments what you think about moments like these when celebrity interviews go completely off script. Because today's story is one of those moments. The kind that nobody on set expects. The kind that producers pray never happens on live television. And the kind that people will talk about long after the cameras stop rolling. The bright studio lights of The View flicker across the polished glass table as the familiar theme music fades out. The audience applauds warmly as the hosts settle into their chairs. The energy in the room is cheerful, casual. Exactly the tone the show prides itself on. Sunny Hostin sits poised, hands folded neatly, her expression sharp but welcoming. Next to her, the other hosts exchange smiles as the conversation flows from politics to entertainment. Then the announcement comes. And joining us today, the moderator says with a grin, is Academy Award-nominated actor Jake Gyllenhaal. The audience erupts. Jake Gyllenhaal walks onto the stage with that relaxed confidence fans know well. Slightly shy smile, soft wave to the crowd, dressed in a dark tailored jacket that makes him look both effortless and polished. He hugs the hosts one by one before taking his seat. "Thank you for having me," Jake says warmly. Sunny smiles politely. "We're glad you're here." At first, everything feels normal. The conversation starts exactly how viewers expect it to. His latest film. The intense preparation. The emotional weight of the role. Jake speaks thoughtfully, leaning forward slightly as he explains the challenges of portraying complicated characters. "I think storytelling is about empathy," he says calmly. "It's about stepping into someone else's life and understanding why people do what they do." The audience nods along. Sunny listens closely, fingers tapping lightly on the table. "And your roles lately," she says, tilting her head slightly, "have been darker. More intense." Jake chuckles softly. "That's one way to describe them. But do you think," Sunny continues, her tone sharpening just a little, "that Hollywood sometimes glamorizes complicated men who do terrible things?" The question hangs in the air longer than expected. Jake pauses, not uncomfortably, but thoughtfully. "I think stories reflect reality," he replies. "People are complicated. Nobody is just one thing." Sunny leans back slightly. "But there's a responsibility, don't you think?" she says. "Especially when millions of people are watching." Jake nods slowly. "Of course." The audience senses something shifting. Not conflict. Not yet. Just tension. The other hosts glance briefly at one another. That subtle on-air awareness that the conversation is drifting somewhere unexpected. Sunny presses forward. "You've played characters who lie, manipulate, even hurt people," she says. "And audiences sometimes walk away admiring them." Jake tilts his head slightly. "Sometimes the point of a story," he answers calmly, "is to make people uncomfortable." The audience murmurs softly. Sunny smiles, but it's the kind of smile that suggests she isn't finished. "Uncomfortable is good," she says. Then she adds something that makes the room shift again. "But accountability is better." Jake's posture changes slightly. Not defensive, just attentive. "What do you mean by that?" he asks. Sunny folds her hands together again. "Well," she says carefully, "there's been criticism over the years that Hollywood actors take on roles that reinforce certain narratives, violence, power, control, and then step back and say, 'It's just a character.'" The crowd grows quieter. Jake's expression remains composed, but his eyes narrow slightly in concentration. "I think actors explore humanity," he says slowly. "The good and the bad." Sunny nods. "But do you ever worry," she says, "that audiences blur the line between the two?" One of the other hosts jumps in quickly with a lighter tone. "I mean, Jake also sings and dances," she laughs. "So we shouldn't make him sound like he only plays villains." The audience laughs. The tension briefly eases. Jake smiles again. "I promise I'm not secretly plotting world domination," he jokes. But Sunny isn't letting the topic go. "And yet," she says, leaning slightly forward again, "you've said in interviews that you're drawn to morally ambiguous characters." Jake nods. "I am. Why?" The simplicity of the question lands harder than expected. Jake takes a breath. Because that's where truth lives, he answers. Sunny raises an eyebrow. Truth? Yes, Jake says calmly. People are messy. People make mistakes. That's what makes stories meaningful. Sunny watches him carefully. And when those stories influence culture? She asks. Jake pauses again. You're asking whether actors should only play heroes. I'm asking, Sunny replies, her voice now noticeably firmer, whether influence comes with responsibility. The audience shifts in their seats. This isn't the typical light celebrity segment anymore. Jake sits back slightly. Well, he says slowly, influence also comes with interpretation. Sunny's gaze sharpens. So you don't believe actors are responsible for the messages their roles send? Jake exhales softly. That's not what I said. The room grows still. The cameras zoom slightly closer. One of the producers behind the scenes whispers something urgently into a headset. Because what started as a conversation is beginning to feel like something else entirely. Sunny leans forward again. And yet, she says, many critics have argued that some of your roles romanticize dangerous personalities. Jake blinks once. Slowly. Which critics? He asks. Sunny doesn't hesitate. Well, let's talk about that. The audience collectively inhales. Jake folds his hands together on the table. Still calm. Still polite. But something in his voice changes when he speaks next. Okay, he says. Let's talk about it. And in that exact moment, everyone watching, in the studio and at home, realizes something unmistakable. This interview just crossed a line, and neither of them seems willing to back away. The polite smiles are fading. The energy in the room is tightening, and what started as a promotional appearance is about to turn into a confrontation no one in that studio expected. Because Sunny Hostin isn't finished with her questions, and Jake Gyllenhaal has just decided he's finished dodging them. And what happens next will make the entire studio audience go silent. For a moment, the studio feels strangely still. Not the comfortable silence of a TV pause, but the kind that makes people shift in their seats. The audience senses it. The hosts sense it. Even the crew members behind the cameras seem to lean forward just a little. Because something about Jake's tone has changed. Not angry, not aggressive, but firm. Sunny Hostin studies him carefully, as if weighing her next words. Well, she begins, keeping her voice steady, critics have pointed to roles where your characters are manipulative, obsessive, even violent, and yet audiences walk away fascinated by them. Jake nods slowly. That's storytelling, he says. Sunny tilts her head. Or is it glamorizing? A faint murmur ripples through the audience. Jake's fingers tap lightly against the glass table before he answers. I think the audience is smarter than that, he replies calmly. Sunny doesn't smile. But media influence is real, she says. We talk about it all the time on this show. Jake leans forward slightly. And I agree, he says. But influence doesn't come from pretending darkness doesn't exist. The room tightens again. One of the other hosts tries to soften the atmosphere. I mean, villains have always been fascinating, she says lightly. Look at classic films. But Sunny gently raises a hand. Sure, she says. But we're talking about modern culture. Jake glances briefly toward the audience, then back at Sunny. I'm curious, he says. Do you believe actors should only take roles that show perfect behavior? Sunny responds quickly. No, but I do believe public figures shape narratives whether they admit it or not. Jake nods slowly. That's fair. Then he pauses. But that responsibility doesn't mean avoiding complicated stories. Sunny leans closer, elbows now resting on the table. Complicated is one thing, she says. But there are viewers who believe Hollywood excuses certain behaviors when they're portrayed by charismatic actors. The audience reacts softly, a mix of curiosity and tension. Jake tilts his head. Are we talking about characters, he asks quietly, or actors? That question lands like a pebble in water. Small, but with ripples. Sunny's eyes narrow slightly. I'm talking about influence, she says. Jake nods again. And influence exists everywhere, he replies. News shows. Talk shows. Films. A couple people in the audience gasp softly. The other hosts glance quickly at one another. Sunny doesn't move. So now you're comparing a news discussion show to fictional storytelling? She asks. Jake shrugs lightly. I'm saying everyone who speaks to millions of people carries influence. The air suddenly feels warmer. A producer off-camera gestures subtly to another host, silently encouraging someone to jump in and redirect the conversation. But before anyone does, Sunny speaks again. Actors get extraordinary platforms, she says. And sometimes it feels like they want the influence without the accountability. Jake's eyebrows lift slightly. That's an interesting assumption. Sunny meets his gaze directly. Is it? Jake sits back. For the first time, a hint of frustration flickers across his face. I've spent 20 years trying to tell meaningful stories, he says. Sunny responds instantly. And no one is questioning your dedication. Jake gives a small, incredulous smile. It kind of feels like you are. The audience reacts with a louder murmur now. The moment is no longer subtle. It's becoming a standoff. Sunny keeps her voice even. I'm asking about responsibility. And I'm answering, Jake says calmly. The words aren't loud, but they carry weight. One of the hosts tries again to ease the tension. Jake, your performances are incredibly intense. I remember watching one of your films and thinking, wow, he disappears into these roles. Jake nods gratefully toward her. Thank you. But Sunny immediately brings the focus back. Intensity can be powerful, she says. Jake exhales slowly. Yes, but power, she continues, comes with consequences. The audience goes quiet again. Jake looks at her carefully. And storytelling has consequences too, he says. Sunny raises an eyebrow. Explain that. Jake leans forward again, voice steady, but more serious now. When we start saying certain stories shouldn't be told because they make people uncomfortable, he says, we start limiting what art can explore. Sunny shakes her head slightly. That's not what I'm saying. Jake gestures gently with one hand. But it's where the conversation can go. Sunny responds sharply. No one is censoring you. Jake meets her gaze. I didn't say you were. Another ripple of murmurs passes through the audience. Backstage, producers are exchanging increasingly nervous glances. This isn't the light debate they planned. Sunny taps a finger lightly on the table. You know, she says slowly, a lot of viewers feel Hollywood actors sometimes avoid difficult questions. Jake chuckles softly. I'm literally answering them right now. The audience laughs nervously. Sunny doesn't. But are you really answering them, she asks. Or are you reframing them? Jake's smile fades. I think, he says carefully, we might be having two different conversations. Sunny leans back slightly. Maybe. Jake pauses, then adds something that makes the room shift again. Or maybe, he says, we're trying to assign moral weight to storytelling that belongs somewhere else. Sunny's eyes narrow again. Where would that be? Jake hesitates for a moment. Then he answers. In how people choose to interpret what they watch. Sunny nods slowly. So the responsibility is entirely on the audience? Jake shakes his head. No. Then where does yours begin? The question hangs heavy in the air. Jake takes a breath before responding. My responsibility, he says quietly, is to tell the truth of the character as honestly as possible. Sunny watches him carefully. And if that character inspires the wrong message? Jake's answer comes almost immediately. Then the conversation about that message is important. Sunny tilts her head, which is exactly what we're doing right now. Jake nods. Yes, but then he adds something that makes the tension spike again. The difference is, he says, I don't believe storytelling should be judged as if it's a moral instruction manual. The audience reacts audibly. Sunny folds her arms now. That's convenient. Jake's eyes widen slightly. Convenient. For actors, she says. Jake leans forward again, his voice still calm but noticeably firmer. I think you're simplifying what artists do. Sunny immediately fires back. And I think you're avoiding the bigger issue. The audience is completely silent now. One of the hosts opens her mouth to speak, then closes it again. Because at this point, everyone realizes something unmistakable. This isn't just a discussion anymore. It's a confrontation. Jake looks directly at Sunny. And what exactly, he asks quietly, do you believe that issue is? Sunny doesn't hesitate. The cultural power Hollywood holds, she says. Jake nods once. Then he says something that makes several people in the audience gasp. Hollywood doesn't control culture the way people think it does. Sunny leans forward instantly. Oh really? Jake's voice stays calm. Yes. Sunny's expression sharpens. Then who does? Jake pauses. For a moment, it seems like he's deciding whether to answer honestly or carefully. And when he finally speaks, the words that come out are not the safe ones. They're shaped, he says slowly, by conversations like this. The audience erupts into a mix of applause, murmurs, and shocked laughter. Sunny's eyes widen slightly, because now the conversation has turned directly toward the show itself. And suddenly, the producers backstage realize something they were hoping to avoid. This interview is no longer about movies. It's about media. And the exchange that follows is about to get even more intense. The reaction in the studio is immediate. A mixture of gasps, scattered applause, and the kind of murmuring that only happens when viewers realize a conversation has crossed into dangerous territory. Sunny Hostin doesn't laugh. She doesn't smile either. Instead, she sits very still, studying Jake Gyllenhaal as if recalibrating the direction of the conversation. For a brief moment, no one speaks. One of the other hosts glances toward the cameras with a polite smile, clearly hoping to jump in and smooth things over. But Sunny beats her to it. So now you're saying media discussions shape culture more than the stories actors choose to tell? Her tone isn't angry, but it's noticeably sharper than before. Jake keeps his posture calm, though his shoulders tighten just slightly. I'm saying conversations influence how people interpret stories, he replies. Sunny tilts her head. And you think this conversation is unfair to you? Jake shakes his head slowly. No. Then what is it? Jake pauses. The audience waits. Finally, he says something that lands with surprising weight. I think sometimes we want art to behave like a moral lecture. The words hang in the air. Sunny folds her arms. And what's wrong with expecting values from the stories we consume? Jake leans forward slightly. Nothing, he says. But stories aren't sermons. A few audience members clap instinctively. Others remain silent. Sunny notices. Her eyes flick briefly toward the crowd, then back to Jake. You know, she says carefully, many people watching at home might hear that and think you're dismissing the impact of media. Jake immediately shakes his head. That's not what I'm saying. But it can sound that way, Sunny presses. Jake exhales slowly. The calm patience he's maintained since the beginning of the interview is beginning to wear thinner. Not dramatically, but noticeably. I think audiences are capable of critical thinking, he says. Sunny responds quickly. Of course they are. But when we assume people will imitate characters simply because they see them, Jake continues, we underestimate them. Sunny's voice grows firmer. Or we recognize how influence works. Jake raises an eyebrow slightly. Influence is complicated. Sunny leans forward again. But accountability shouldn't be. The audience murmurs again. The tension is back. Stronger this time. One of the hosts tries once more to lighten the mood. I mean, Jake has played heroes too, she says with a laugh. We should remind everyone of that. A few people laugh. Jake smiles politely. But Sunny doesn't move away from the issue. Heroes can also be flawed, she says. Jake nods. Yes, but audiences often idolize flawed men, Sunny adds. Jake pauses. There's something in the way she says it that changes the atmosphere again. You think that's unique to movies? He asks. Sunny looks at him carefully. No. Jake gestures lightly with one hand. Because public figures in every field are idolized. Sunny immediately responds. And many of them should be questioned. Jake nods. Agreed. The audience senses a moment of possible resolution. But then Sunny asks another question. One that no one in the room expected. So let me ask you this directly, she says. Jake's eyes narrow slightly. Okay. Sunny's voice is steady. Do you believe actors should ever refuse roles that might normalize harmful behavior? The room goes completely silent. Even the hosts beside them stop moving. Jake leans back slightly. He doesn't answer immediately. Sunny waits. The cameras zoom in just a little closer. Finally, Jake speaks. I think actors should choose roles that challenge them. Sunny doesn't blink. That's not what I asked. Jake smiles faintly. I know. Sunny leans forward again. So answer it. The audience shifts uneasily. Jake's voice remains calm, but the tension in it is now unmistakable. If we start deciding which stories are too dangerous to tell, he says, we risk losing the ability to explore difficult truths. Sunny responds instantly. Or we protect audiences from harmful narratives. Jake shakes his head slightly. That assumes audiences are passive. Sunny raises her voice just slightly. Influence doesn't require passivity. A few people in the audience clap again. Jake's expression tightens. I agree influence exists, he says. Sunny interrupts. Then you agree actors carry responsibility. Jake pauses. Yes. The answer surprises the room. Sunny blinks once. Okay, she says. Then what does that responsibility look like to you? Jake takes a breath. For me, he says slowly, It means portraying characters honestly, even when they're flawed. Sunny shakes her head. But that still avoids the question of impact. Jake's voice becomes firmer. Impact isn't always predictable. Sunny responds immediately. But ignoring it isn't responsible. The audience reaction grows louder again. The energy in the room now feels almost confrontational. Behind the cameras, producers are whispering urgently. Someone gestures toward a cue card suggesting a commercial break. But the hosts at the table are too engaged now. The moment has taken on a life of its own. Jake looks directly at Sunny again. "Can I ask you something?" he says. Sunny raises an eyebrow. "Sure." Jake leans forward. "Do you believe audiences can watch a story about a flawed person without being encouraged to imitate them?" Sunny answers quickly. "Sometimes." Jake nods. "Exactly." Sunny tilts her head. "But sometimes not." Jake pauses. "And when that happens," he says, "the conversation should be about why." Sunny folds her hands together again. "That's exactly what we're doing." Jake's smile returns briefly, but this time it's more restrained. "Yes," he says. "But it feels less like a conversation and more like a trial." The audience reacts with an audible gasp. Sunny's eyes widen slightly. "A trial?" Jake shrugs lightly. "Just how it feels." Sunny's tone becomes noticeably cooler. "This show asks difficult questions." Jake nods. "And I respect that." Sunny leans forward. "Then why call it a trial?" Jake hesitates. The audience waits. For the first time since the interview began, Jake glances briefly toward the other hosts, almost as if checking whether anyone else will step in. No one does. So he answers, because sometimes it feels like the conclusion is already decided. The reaction is immediate. A wave of shocked murmurs fills the studio. Sunny sits back slowly. "You think we came into this interview with an agenda?" Jake holds her gaze. "I think sometimes conversations about Hollywood start with assumptions." Sunny's expression hardens slightly. "And sometimes Hollywood avoids accountability." Jake doesn't look away. Maybe both things can be true. The audience erupts again, half applause, half stunned silence. And suddenly everyone realizes something unmistakable. The conversation has gone far beyond a discussion about movies. Now it's about media, power, narratives, and who gets to control them. The studio lights feel hotter. The air feels heavier. And the producers behind the cameras are now making urgent hand signals. Because the next few minutes of this interview could either calm everything down or send the entire broadcast into a moment that viewers will replay online for days. Sunny looks at Jake one more time. Her next question comes slowly, carefully, but with an intensity that sends a ripple through the audience before she even finishes speaking. "Then let me ask you one final thing." The room falls silent again. Jake nods. "Go ahead." Sunny's voice drops slightly. "If actors don't shape culture the way people think they do." She leans forward. "Why do they fight so hard to control the narrative about themselves?" The audience gasps. Jake's expression changes instantly. And in that moment, everyone in the studio realizes the conversation has just reached its most explosive point yet. Because this question is no longer about characters. It's about him. The gasp that moves through the studio is impossible to ignore. It spreads like a ripple across the audience, bouncing from one row to the next as people realize exactly what Sunny Hostin just did. The question isn't theoretical anymore. It's personal. Jake Gyllenhaal sits still for a moment, his expression unreadable. The cameras tighten their focus, capturing every detail. The slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers slowly interlock on the glass table. Across from him, Sunny watches carefully. The room is silent enough that even the faint hum of the studio lights seems louder. Jake exhales slowly. Then he nods. "That's a fair question," he says. The audience shifts slightly in their seats. Some people expected anger. Others expected a deflection. Instead, Jake leans forward again, his voice calm but noticeably more serious than it's been all interview. "I think the reason actors care about narratives," he begins, "is because narratives affect real people." Sunny tilts her head slightly. "So you do acknowledge that power?" Jake nods. "Of course." The audience murmurs again. "But there's a difference," he continues, "between shaping how people see you and controlling culture itself." Sunny folds her arms lightly. Those lines blur. Jake gives a small smile. "They can." Sunny leans forward again. "So when actors push back against criticism," she says, "that's not about protecting influence?" Jake shakes his head slowly. "No." "Then what is it?" Jake pauses before answering. It's about context. The word hangs in the air. Sunny raises an eyebrow. Context. Jake nods. Actors become symbols in conversations that are often bigger than the work itself. Sunny responds quickly. Welcome to being a public figure. A few people in the audience laugh nervously. Jake smiles faintly. I'm aware. But you benefit from that attention, Sunny continues. Jake nods again. Yes. And that attention shapes culture. Jake doesn't deny it this time. That's partly true. Sunny's voice sharpens. Partly. Jake gestures slightly toward the audience. Culture is shaped by audiences too. The crowd reacts with scattered applause. Sunny doesn't interrupt. Jake continues. Every viewer brings their own perspective, their own experiences. A film doesn't exist in a vacuum. Sunny considers that. But influence still flows from the screen outward, she says. Jake nods. Sometimes. Then he adds something that softens the tension in the room more than anyone expected. But conversations like this shape it just as much. The audience applauds again. Even some of the other hosts nod. Sunny watches him carefully, clearly weighing whether to challenge that point again. For a moment, it looks like she might. But instead she asks something quieter. So what do you hope audiences take away from the characters you play? Jake thinks about it. Not for show. Not dramatically. Just honestly. I hope they ask questions, he says. Sunny tilts her head. What kind of questions? Jake looks out toward the audience briefly before answering. Why people behave the way they do. The room grows thoughtful. Because if we only show perfect heroes, he continues, we stop examining the parts of humanity that need understanding. Sunny nods slowly. That's a powerful argument. Jake smiles lightly. I think stories are meant to start conversations. Sunny glances around the studio. Well, she says with a small laugh, this one certainly did. The audience laughs with her, a wave of relief finally passing through the room. Even Jake chuckles. For the first time in several minutes, the tension eases. One of the other hosts jumps in quickly. I think everyone in this room just experienced the most intense film discussion we've ever had. The audience applauds again. Sunny turns back to Jake. Her tone is calmer now. Look, I push hard on these questions because media influence matters. Jake nods. I respect that. Sunny offers a small smile. And to your credit, you didn't dodge anything. Jake shrugs lightly. I tried not to. The audience laughs again. But even as the laughter settles, something about the moment feels significant. The conversation didn't explode. It didn't collapse. Instead, it turned into something rare for live television. An unscripted debate that forced both sides to explain themselves. The segment wraps up shortly after. Jake thanks the hosts. The audience stands and applauds as the cameras pull back and the show transitions to the next topic. But the moment doesn't end there. Because within minutes of the broadcast ending, clips of the exchange begin spreading online. Viewers on social media argue over who made the stronger points. Some praise Sunny Hostin for pressing hard questions about cultural influence. Others defend Jake Gyllenhaal for standing his ground and challenging the assumptions behind those questions. Headlines start appearing within hours. Unexpected clash on live TV. Jake Gyllenhaal pushes back during heated interview. Debate over Hollywood influence erupts on The View. The clip trends across platforms. Comment sections fill with thousands of opinions. Some viewers call the exchange refreshing, a rare moment of honest conversation on daytime television. Others describe it as uncomfortable, even confrontational. But almost everyone agrees on one thing. It was unforgettable. A moment where the polished structure of a talk show gave way to something raw and real. A conversation that moved beyond promotion and into the complicated relationship between media, culture, and influence. And whether people agreed with Sunny or with Jake, millions of viewers suddenly found themselves thinking about the questions raised in that studio. Questions about storytelling, responsibility, and the power of narrative. But now we want to hear from you. Do you think actors carry responsibility for the cultural impact of the characters they portray? Or do you believe audiences are responsible for how they interpret the stories they watch? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy dramatic, behind-the-scenes stories about celebrity moments, media clashes, and unforgettable interviews, make sure you subscribe to Stage View, like this video, and share it with friends who love these intense Hollywood stories. Because sometimes the most unforgettable drama doesn't happen in movies. It happens live,